Good evening, everyone. So glad to see you all here tonight. My name is Deborah Schwartz. I'm the president of the Brooklyn Historical Society, and it is really a great pleasure to welcome you here as we head into really hot weather. So we're here to talk about kind of a hot topic, I would say. I just want to start before kind of kicking into our program tonight to tell you just a little bit about Brooklyn Historical Society. I know I see a lot of familiar faces, some not so familiar faces. If you have not been here before, can you just raise your hand so I have a sense? Fantastic. Welcome. Welcome to our regulars and welcome to our newcomers. This space that you're in is full of interesting programs, night after night, week after week. And so we really encourage you to check out our program brochure in the back, to sign up for our email list, and to not miss any of the interesting things that happen here. Our mission at the Brooklyn Historical Society is to look deeply and thoughtfully at history, and to really try to understand how it connects to who we are now and where we're going in the future. And so our programming is a real reflection of that. I have one really incredibly exciting announcement for you that I am pinching myself before I tell you this. As of Friday, we will be opening a second exhibition space in Dumbo in the Empire Stores building. It's called Brooklyn Historical Society Dumbo. Catchy name, eh? Thank you. It will be open at 55 Water Street. If you have not been in the Empire Stores building, it is an exquisite 19th century warehouse building. And we will use it to celebrate in all kinds of ways the history of the Brooklyn waterfront, which is not unconnected to what we're going to be talking about this evening. The opening exhibition in Dumbo is an exhibition called Shifting Perspectives. It's a photography exhibition. And it's just about 15 minutes walk down the hill to get there. So we really encourage you to come and visit us. It's also worth noting that we'll have, starting in December, a new exhibition there that is about the history of the Brooklyn waterfront. And it will be highly interactive and very family friendly. So tell your friends about that as well. So our program this evening is really the result of an incredibly lovely institutional conversation that has taken place over the last 2 years or so between the Brooklyn Historical Society and the Van Allen Institute. I want to thank my colleague, Marcia Eli, who is here with us, who is our vice president for programs and communications, who really helped to nurture this conversation and is the brains behind so many of the programs we do here. So thank you, Marcia. But really what we discovered along the way was that there was a great deal that we shared with the Van Allen Institute. These are two organizations that think a great deal about urban planning, about urban design, about the nature of community, and what it means in terms of the quality of life we have in New York City. And so that was kind of a natural match. And to talk a little bit about the Van Allen Institute, I want to welcome Stephen Thompson, who is the manager of programs and communications, who's going to just say a few words about that and introduce our moderator. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. Well, in case you want to know a little bit more about Van Allen, which I'm sure we all do, we're a nonprofit organization based in the Flatiron District. We've been around for a little over 120 years, organizing design competitions, public programs, research projects. always looking at how the design of the city impacts our experience of our everyday lives and also how we impact the environment through the lens of really urgent issues like climate change and equity. We are in the midst of our current spring public programs festival. It's called Arteries, NYC in Circulation. We're looking tonight at Gowanus Canal, an artery that is being unclogged over the recent decades and reassessed through different means from real estate, environmental remediation, grassroots arts, and so it's exciting to have everyone in the same room today. We're wrapping up our festival tomorrow with 2 exciting events. At the South Street Seaport, we're doing a lunchtime talk looking at the future of the kiosk, what it should look and feel like, how does local cultural context and technology fit into that. That's in partnership with the organization Black Gotham Experience. And then we're wrapping up our festival tomorrow evening in South Williamsburg in an artistic experience aboard a double-decker bus at sunset. That will be led by Daniel Behar, who's an artist who's actually been featured in exhibitions and panel discussions at Brooklyn Historical Society. So it's great to have that continuous thread. And he'll be leading a tour that's looking at the gerrymandered arteries of South Williamsburg that have been redistricted in recent years along the New York State Assembly District. And he'll be accompanied by other performance artists who will be making a pretty lively evening to close out our festival. If we have any architects or landscape architects in the room, we are offering continuing education credits, so you can register for that at our little table up there. And again, I just want to say we're so thankful to partner with BHS today. Thank you also to Marcia and to Meredith Duncan for putting this great panel together. To let you know a little bit more about our moderator, Joseph Alexiou. Joseph is the author of Gowanus, Brooklyn's Curious Canal. He was once a features editor at Time Out New York, and his work has been published in New York Magazine's Daily Intel, Out Magazine, Paper Magazine, and the almost forgotten New York Press. He also wrote the 6th edition of Paris for Dummies, but this was just before France had embraced the smartphone, and so he is now obsolete. His words, not mine. So
Thank you.
Thank
you for reading that part. That's yeah.
Okay. I'll let you continue this discussion of the canal that is no longer obsolete.
Thank you so much. I want to start by thanking the Van Allen Institute and the Brooklyn Historical Society for hosting tonight. A quick note on the Brooklyn Historical Society. First of all, this is maybe the third or fourth time now I've gotten to be their guest. And it's been amazing. There's always a full room here. It always sort of blows my mind a little bit. This library and this building is beautiful and historic. Even the bathroom signs have like little 19th century, sort of railroad mogul dressed people, on the sign. And you've got these beautiful fixtures. The Othmar Library is amazing. I did a lot of research here. And you can find so much uncovered Brooklyn history really in the archives. So if you ever need something to do for an afternoon, it's so hot. Honestly, this is a great place to hang out in. Anyway, they did not pay me to say that. I have some very distinguished panelists with me today to discuss, as you can see the title up here, it says Gowanus' Triple Bypass, Change Through Art, Design, and the Environment. And so I'm very lucky today to have with me here 4 people who are well-versed in the life, La Vie Gowanus, which is French for the Gowanus life. I know you need help with all that.
For dummies.
For dummies, yes. The Paris Q&A will be at the end of this. But each person here has figured out in some way or another how to make their life involve either art, design, the urban life, the urban sort of biological architecture that is Gowanus has intersected with their work or life in some way, and so that's why they're here. And so I will be introducing them, starting to my left with Abby Subak, and I'm going to read exactly as you wrote here from this. Also, another obsolete thing, paper. I don't know if you remember that, but actually, I love paper, and the archive is full of paper. So anyway, Abby Subak is the Executive Director of Arts Gowanus, a nonprofit community organization working to support, promote, and advocate for artists and sustainable creative community in Gowanus. Arts Gowanus is best known for organizing the annual Gowanus Open Studios event every October, and also provides professional development for artists, several art exhibitions every year and also collaborates with other neighborhood and city organizations to incorporate art into many aspects of life. And a lifelong artist and maker, Abby paints and draws and works in textiles. Her art studio is in the old box factory in Gowanus. We will talk about that factory. Personally, I want to say, I remember when I moved to Gowanus in 2006, Gowanus Open Studios was happening, and there was this map, and I did go. That was my first show I went to. You get to go inside of people's apartments sometimes, and their studios, which is also their apartment. Open Studios in general is very cool, and it made Gowanus seem cool, and I believe it just blows up and gets bigger every year and every year. So first of all, congratulations, and second of all, I don't know if you guys know this, but Gowanus is considered one of the coolest, artsiest neighborhoods in all of the world. So you're looking at a very important art celebrity right now. Next down the line is Jared Della Valle. Am I pronouncing that right?
That's pretty good, yeah.
How do you actually say it?
Della Valle.
Della Valle, okay. My last name is pronounced Alexiou.
Got it.
It's really hard for some people. Anyway, Jared has been a real estate professional and architect for more than 18 years and has managed the acquisition and pre-development of more than 1 million square feet in New York City, along the High Line, in the Hudson Yards, and in Dumbo, which is here in Brooklyn. He actually sits on the board of the Van Allen Institute, the Architecture League of New York, and also the Downtown Brooklyn Partnership, and is a member of the U.S. Green Building Council. He has previously taught at several universities and lectured widely, and his work has been the subject of more than 200 articles and publications. He holds a BA from Lehigh University and a master's in both architecture and construction management from Washington University. One thing I'll say about Jared, I know that we'll talk about this more, but he also, his I guess, development company, which is, do you want to say the name of it? Is that okay?
Yeah, no, I'm not afraid. Alloy Development.
Alloy Development, one of the things that I find interesting about it is, and you were talking about this just before, is that every person that works as a developer actually is or has been an architect, or worked as one in the past at some point, if I'm not mistaken.
That's correct, yeah.
Imagine if all of the publishers in the world had been journalists at one point, what the world would be like. Anyway,
Or politicians.
Ooh. Well, don't worry, we'll get to that. If you think you can escape it, you can't. You cannot escape it tonight. It's very relevant to where we're sitting. No, it's pretty relevant. And so next on the line is David Briggs. Hi, David. Do you prefer Dave or David?
It doesn't matter.
Okay, I actually hate that question for myself, so sorry about that. David is the principal of Loci Architecture, correct? Loci Architecture, and the executive director of Gowanus by Design, a nonprofit that investigates new planning strategies for the Gowanus neighborhood and how they are impacted by the impending cleanup of the heavily contaminated EPA Superfund site. GBD's design competitions and projects speculate upon the potential for how the neighborhood could become a model for 21st century city planning in and around contaminated urban areas. It says Dave here, that's why I asked. David lives 2 blocks from the canal with his wife and 2 teenage sons.
Emphasis on teenage, yes.
Oh, yeah, teenage. So Dave suffers now until about, I'd say 2020, maybe? I'm just guessing how old they are. No? Okay.
Yeah, no, sooner.
Sooner than that. Okay. Well, David, and in particular, Gowanus by Design, one of the things that competition really did for the neighborhood was give a space for designers of all kinds to come through, look at real problems that actually exist in both the design world, in the real estate world, in the environmental world, in New York City, in Brooklyn, and address them in a way that allowed them to really create and be creative. And you should know that just before the competition was finished and it was going on and you were calling for people to be involved, so many people, random people that I barely knew, once they found out that I was involved in Gowanus, would ask me, how can I get involved? Should I submit a project? Students from all over the world. People are paying attention to what we do here in New York City, and that's not a chest-thumping, masculinity contest. People are paying attention because we are a very innovative place, and we certainly have a lot to talk about and say. And so that platform, I think, was really important for Gowanus, and that is we're all here for a reason, and that's why you're here. Finally, I promise not to talk too much during the rest of this, but Our final panelist for tonight is Dr. Philip Silva. He is an environmental researcher, advocate, and educator. He is the co-founder of Tree Kit, which is an initiative to help city dwellers to measure, map, and manage urban forests. And that's a really sort of quick reduction. Philip's project has been geo-positioning individual trees in New York City since what year?
2010?
2010. And do you know how many approximately you've mapped at this point?
Well, now that the method was incorporated into the New York City street tree census, all of them, all 680,000 some street trees across the city. So
Wow.
I didn't do that personally.
But you did create the possibility
did.
for that to happen,
We did.
and I can't even find where I parked my friend's car. So I'm going to stop with all that. Blah, blah, blah. Managing, all right, he's helping city dwellers to manage urban forests. He also works with Farming Concrete to help community gardeners throughout the world measure all the good things happening in their gardens. He is an essayist and podcast producer at The Nature of Cities, which is an informational website about cities as an ecological space. Philip holds a PhD in natural resources from Cornell University and a master's degree in urban policy analysis and management from the New School, where he also currently serves as a part-time lecturer. Thank you, Philip. Philip is obviously here because he knows about the urban and the ecological at the same time. If you're going to talk about Gowanus, you pretty much have to have at least one person who knows a little bit about that. So, I want to say thank you to all the panelists for coming today. I want you all to know that I have never been a moderator before. Usually, other people moderate me. I don't know why that is, but thanks again, BHS, for allowing me this forum. I'm going to launch right in. Gowanus is one of my favorite topics ever. I would love to challenge anyone, whether or not they think they know more than I do about the history of Gowanus Canal. I've been working very hard at this, and believe me, I tattooed a map of it to the side of my body. So if you really want to have that discussion, I would love to go there right here, right now. If you know anything about Gowanus, keep that in your pocket. We will have Q&A stuff, because what you're looking at here is a panel of really knowledgeable people, and so I'm really thrilled to talk to you. And so I'm going to start right away, and I'm going to go right down the line. And my first question for tonight is, what is it about Gowanus, the neighborhood, that brought you to settle here and use it as a space for creativity, for the production of things or intellectual work, or in the case of design, why Gowanus? Why develop in Gowanus? Why do art in Gowanus? What is it about Gowanus as an environmental space that draws you to this particular place? What is that about? Abby?
So I can talk about myself personally, but then I also work with hundreds, if not a couple thousand artists who have their studio and maker spaces in Gowanus. So I'm going to take the liberty to speak on behalf of artists to some degree too, and artists who I see out there can correct me as needed. Why did artists end up in Gowanus? I think there's really obvious reasons. There were big spaces. They were manufacturing spaces. They were affordable, as a lot of manufacturing was leaving the neighborhood. We're okay?
No, we're good. I'm putting up a picture that might be relevant to you
Yes.
and what you're talking about. Please continue.
That's one of the buildings that was a manufacturing building or a warehousing building or both, and is now full of artist studios. So I think for artists, certainly in New York City and around the world, what you're looking for are, number one, an affordable space, and number two, a space where I'm going to say anything goes. And in Gowanus, for a long time, anything could go. So that means you have floors that aren't pristine, you have streets that aren't pristine, you have buildings that aren't pristine, and you can really let go a bit with your creativity and experimentation. I'm also going to jump in at this point and say I think there's this real connection that a lot of people don't realize for artists. And I'm coming from a space where I'm really worried about artists staying in New York City and artists losing their ability to work in the city. I think we still have a lot of really interesting exhibition places, but I think what makes the streets live and breathe and the arteries of New York City and the community is having artists living and breathing and working in these spaces. And on our streets and in our neighborhoods. So I am, one, working on the assumption that that's valuable to our city, and two, that it's threatened right now. I think one of the things that a lot of people don't realize or think about is the connection between industrial zones and manufacturing zones and artists. And as New York City has shifted so much away from manufacturing and industry, we're losing a lot of those spaces that were artist spaces also. So I think there's a real synergy there, and maybe even more than that, a real dependency, at least for artists, on the manufacturing areas. And as many of these manufacturing areas are being turned into residences, we're losing real maker spaces. So I think that is what Gowanus, when it became a canal to become industrial. We can get into a whole metaphysical, there's great energy there and creativity and centuries of it that you feel when you walk around the canal area, whether it's heavy manufacturing and piles of scrap metal down to somewhere in the middle, wood manufacturing. And I know specific artists and makers and manufacturers that work along the spectrum. I really think of it as a spectrum, that at one end you have heavy manufacturing, and at the other end maybe you have painting or painting on silk or something really light and delicate. And I think that there's points all along that spectrum, and I think that thinking of them as connected is very important. And I think also realizing that any individual artist might be working at several points along that spectrum are really important. So in Gowanus, you might have an iron fabricator who's doing really heavy work for the city, iron, I don't know, for the MTA or the DOT and keeping us safe. And then they're having slightly lighter, more architecturally appealing ironwork, and then they're having their crazy art for the sake of art. There's no functionality to it. And that's all happening in the same space. Same thing with wood, same thing with glass and other media that we see out there. So I think that's another really important factor of what was happening in Gowanus that brought artists to Gowanus and have kept artists in Gowanus.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Jared.
Yeah, I mean, we're a development company, but as Joseph mentioned, we're all architects. And so we try to find places where we ourselves are comfortable and excited. So that usually means we're seeking authenticity of some kind, where a neighborhood can resonate with us. We've been in Dumbo for the last 17 or 18 years, and we've witnessed the sort of the change and candidly participated in some of the change, and helping to manage that change and set the expectations for the quality of change, I think, is something that a company like ours can do. We try to focus on neighborhoods that have meaningful challenges. This is obviously one that does. Sometimes they're infrastructural, sometimes it's about establishing a precedent for what that change could be like or should be like, or sometimes that's making a lesson out of what hasn't been done well. And so we are either in the position of setting expectation or offering critique on our peer set. And as a community of, our entire office lives and works in Brooklyn, and so we really like to focus on Brooklyn. And as we tackle a neighborhood like Gowanus, it offers such interesting opportunities to reconsider, rethink both the history of the place and what the future should be like, and what is, inevitable change in a lot of ways.
Really quickly, since you said this word that I think is very important, what did you mean when you said you look for neighborhoods with authenticity?
Yeah, it's hard to describe. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think, for us, authenticity oftentimes has to do with knowing that the people who started there and or helped create the quality of the place are still there, and that fabric of that is still there, rather than it becoming solely about tourism, right, or some other economic agenda. And so you get the broad spectrum of diversity, right, when you're addressing both families who've lived there forever, and my grandfather had a candle factory on the Columbia waterfront, and, Italian-American family, and participating in the sort of older version of Gowanus in a lot of ways, and going there as a kid with my dad he used to sell chemicals and other things like that, and, some of those families are still there, and they're entrenched and embedded there, and then you have, call it the existing manufacturing that's, the remnants of the existing manufacturing, which are, either still sort of holding on tight, and this is where their business is, and that's where they're staying, to the new gentrifiers, which are usually artists, right, who are the initial people who are making do in and making, trying to find inexpensive space or creative space. And again, we saw it happen in Dumbo, and it will happen here, and it will happen again in the Bronx, and it will happen in other neighborhoods. And so it's hard to find places that have that spectrum of diversity, which I think is one of the best parts about living in a city.
Great. Well, thank you so much. That's great. David.
I moved to Carroll Gardens in the late 80s, and I did not know anything about the Gowanus. I discovered it because I would go for a run up to Prospect Park, and I would cross it. And along the way, I became interested in it as a waterway in the center of brownstone Brooklyn. And without going into a long sort of year-by-year storyline, eventually I got my head around this idea, particularly when the Superfund designation happened, is how do you design a better city around a contaminated waterway? And as someone who was exposed early on in architecture to sustainable design, I felt there might be an opportunity here to design a sustainable urban ecosystem that actually, nature does not have intent, but we, when we're designing our cities and we're thinking about their future, that there is intent. And I think part of the challenge with Gowanus is whose intent is it? And just to comment on what I'm seeing out here in the crowd, this is not a particularly diverse crowd, but the Gowanus is a very diverse crowd. And one of our projects we're doing now is the Gowanus Atlas. We're actually reaching out to members of the community. Jared and Abby are part of that project. You can see it on our website, to try to get a sense of what their stories are about the Gowanus, both pre-Superfund and currently. And hopefully out of this work that we do, we can sort of model a future that sort of picks up on what Jared's talking about when the artists come and make a place cool. How can we keep it there before it becomes so gentrified that it becomes much more of a homogeneous culture? So it's sort of very high level, that's our goal and my mission with the organization.
Just to sort of, and what do you think about the nature of the neighborhood itself? What is it about the neighborhood that makes that work for you? Or what is it that you discovered, I guess?
I'm not, it's actually, I think the people. When I was first going through Gowanus, anything did go, and it was a lot of warehouses. There weren't a lot of people on the streets like there are now, but there were a lot of people working there. And I think if you talk to some other members of the community, such as Paul Basile from Gowanus Alliance, he'll talk quite eloquently about that. But the fact that there's this environmental scar that's been wrought on the neighborhood that started in the mid-19th century, and that's just sort of been allowed to exist until, I guess, 7 years ago when it was designated a Superfund site. It's sort of a fascinating environmental problem to me, but it also is a fascinating urban problem because people are moving to cities, and there's a lot of pressure to develop undevelopable land. And Gowanus is a very good example of that. There are 3 MGP sites down there that are heavily, heavily contaminated. And how do you design a better community around a challenge like that? And I just think it's an interesting problem. I don't have the solution. Part of this is about my own education. But we just move forward with our work.
Great, thank you. Philip.
So I think I have a poetic and a pragmatic response to this, right? So the poetic is that, and this echoes everything that you've heard so far, that this landscape really just sparks the imagination. And so I teach at the New School. I teach courses on urban sustainability for young designers. And I and my colleagues often come back to the Gowanus as a place to help young people upend all of their assumptions and expectations about what nature is and what the city is, and how the two either come together or collide or mesh, right? I teach my students about the concept of the cyborg city, right? This is completely a biotic and mechanical landscape working together. And it doesn't work perfectly all the time, but it does spark the imagination to think about something beyond just conservation and restoration on one side versus urban development on the other, right? No matter what, we've got this landscape and we've got to work with it. So it keeps us on our toes, right? The more pragmatic side is that there are a lot of really creative organizations and hardworking organizations that are results-oriented. So TreeKit, my organization, is sort of a behind-the-scenes environmental organization. We work with the folks that are on the front lines doing conservation work or restoration work. And so one of the groups we work with is Gowanus Canal Conservancy. GCC had the vision years before the 2015 New York City street tree census to say, hey, we're taking care of street trees in this neighborhood because we believe they offer a number of benefits, including stormwater capture to clean up the canal. But where are they, and what are they? And in knowing where they are and what they are, can we better manage them? So they reached out to us at TreeKit in order to start to map roughly 1,000 trees in an area tightly around the canal. They essentially set the precedent for how then 600,000 plus street trees got mapped by 2,000 plus volunteers all across New York City. So that innovation happened right there in Gowanus, just because, well, not just, but in particular because there was an organization there that wanted to try something new, but also had the sweat equity to get it off the ground and really wanted to mobilize folks, mobilize volunteers, try it out, make some mistakes, learn from them, and work with us to get it off the ground. So I'll recap. It sparks the imagination, and it's a place where you can get work done.
Oh, I like that. You want to write that down?
Sure.
I do have like a sort of roadmap of questions, but as with all things, in my view, they all kind of slide together. So I want to take everything that you guys said, and we will sort of segue into the next question, but there's a theme clearly here to me, and I'm just going to throw out some things that I always get to say when I do these Gowanus talks. One is that every story in New York City is a real estate story. That is the truth, and you can apply that, let's say, philosophy to almost any situation in New York. Every New York Times story, every story that happens, I would argue, it comes down to someone that has a tiny little piece of this city and what they want from it, what they want out of it, whether or not they control it, and all of that. And so when Abby talks about artists needing cheap space that is easy and you can be rough on, and that's a real estate story, because we're talking about buildings and building stock and them not being used for their original use and therefore being cheap, blah, 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 blah. All of Soho went through this very famously, and now you know that if you want to buy a $900 t-shirt, you go to Soho. So, this is part of a process in which we look at why the city is the way it is, and to me, it always comes back to this adage: every story is a real estate story. But there's more going on here, and I think when you look at Gowanus, and this really will segue into my next question, but what you guys, and correct me if I'm wrong, you're describing a neighborhood which is unique among all other neighborhoods in New York, and we're trying to figure out why. There's this massive scar on the land, which you put it. It has this intense industrial history that has left behind all of these buildings. It presents problems that, are good to tackle if you are interested in buildings at all. And moreover, it continues to challenge your understanding of a city, because it's not a normal city neighborhood. One, it has a tidal estuary in it. Tidal estuary is a body of water that reaches inland, and it has no current flow, only tidal movement, and that's a tidal estuary. That is what the Gowanus is. So let's see if we can go back. These are a little out of order, and so I'll explain the one that we had up behind here. This is a new development called the Lightstone Project, and this is happening on the Gowanus Canal area on Bond Street, between Bond and the Canal, right by, this is the Carroll Street Bridge. This is a building that has been under development, arguably on some form or another, since the 2010 or so, maybe even earlier, if you think about it. When the Toll Brothers arrived, I want to say that was 2008. 6, 7, really? Oh, you know what? It was pre-crash. It was pre-crash. It was when I moved in. I remember. Right. Yes, that's right. Maybe 2006, 7. Really, Gowanus, I think, as the most contemporary development of that particular Bond Street corridor, to me, started in 2004. But that's the Green Building, which we can talk about later. This is a view of the Gowanus. If you wonder what it's looking like and you've never seen it, I can't imagine that. Maybe you have not, but all kinds of people are welcome at the Brooklyn Historical Society. So, I put this up also. We like this because it illustrates a lot of what Gowanus is about right now and how it is mid-change. Because what happened is during the period of time in which, let's say the industrial era failed and this new digital era began, the area was useless. And there are some people who remember very clearly a time where, cars being lit on fire was the norm in Gowanus. So you had a lot of parking lots and sort of areas where no one wants to be is where stuff ended up. And then you have these boats that sank. And then you have these pylons that hold up the bridges, and true to the gentrifying nature of this neighborhood, all of the ephemera crap being thrown onto the pylons are the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times. Oh, I'm done with this Wall Street Journal, I'll just throw it away. Like, you know, they used to use that to light fire with and like insulate your home. You're wasting perfectly good material. But anyway, the point is that I think this picture really illustrates kind of where Gowanus is headed. We don't really know, but you know, you can learn a lot from other people's garbage. Now, this building, which was on before, is, if it's not clear, it is full of artist studios. The Gowanus Canal Conservancy's office is here. It used to be a factory for making packing boxes, which if you think about a port like Gowanus is kind of meta. You know, there's a factory to make boxes, which is for delivering goods, and this is actually protected by the loft law, if I'm not mistaken, right? Like the artists that live there, or is it the building next door? Darn it. Okay. Every story in New York is a real estate story.
Loft law, you can see that little bit of that yellow building behind the box factory, right?
That
over
one,
there.
okay, the
That's
one
loft
beyond
law.
there is protected by the loft law there. So the loft law is artists and residents took over this building or colonized part of it in the mid-'80s. One woman who's been there since at least 1984, Margaret Mogenet, actually was in the New York Times in 2011 for getting her landlord to fix the stairwell. In order to do that, she had to hold her rent in escrow for, I think, a decade or something crazy like that.
Well, the box factory is a little bit interesting because when in the mid 2000s, so around 2005, 2006, the property owner wanted to sell it,
Right.
and the artists who were squatting there and had studios there actually rallied enough money to buy it from the owner, convert it to commercial condos, so they are individually owned commercial condos, but
wow.
all by artists right now.
So
No
it's
residents.
zoned commercially, completely.
commercially.
Okay, so again, every story in New York is a real estate story. If one asks, how can you in theory protect a commercial space that's going to allow for makers and creatives and artists like Abby, it has to be within their hands. They have to own it. They have to be able to control part of it. And so I'm glad you brought that up because here we have an old building and it was clearly able to be kind of messed around with and roughed up, and it was cheap at the time, and it was affordable enough for these artists to buy it. That's rare. But if you ask what Gowanus is going to look like in 20 years, it may look exactly like this because the artists own it. So maybe I should sort of move on. I'm just going to put up this building here as next, and the reason I'm going to do that, and then I'm going to go on to the next question, is this is a short one-story building, industrial. It's actually reads across there, it says Scranton and Lehigh Coal Company. Now that sign has been deteriorating for a while now, so it doesn't say that as much. This is not a landmarked building, but to me this is historic Gowanus. It is a one-story industrial building that used to be owned by a coal company. And this coal company is so old that they have a concrete sign on front. Coal and heat and fuel were paramount industries in Gowanus, and they are the primary reason why it is toxically polluted to this day. So the coal industry, to give you an example, there was so much coal going up and down the Gowanus Canal that in early 02, there was a Pennsylvania coal strike and there was no coal at all. And so what the poor people of Gowanus started to do was look in coal yards for loose coal, and then they started dredging with their own hands, buckets, shovels, the bottom of the canal for free loose coal to burn in their houses. Because if you didn't have coal, then you froze. Historic Gowanus right here. Anyway, so I'm supposed to stop talking. Here we go. So my next question for everyone, and maybe we'll start on the opposite end and go this way, is related, and it is there a connection to design as a concept, since this is a big theme of this talk, and the kind of businesses themselves that open up in Gowanus? And this is something we touched on a little bit, but I'm really asking specifically about the physical character of this neighborhood. Is there a connection between the way this neighborhood is set up, unlike other New York City neighborhoods, and the kind of businesses that are open now or open historically? And what do you think that is? And each of you has a perspective to bring in here, and so I'd like to hear it.
I'll go out on a limb. I don't think I can speak to businesses, but I can speak to nonprofit organizations that want interesting playground to play in, right? So, again, the same thing I said before, the Gowanus sparks the imagination. There's a lot you can get away with historically in the Gowanus. I mean, there's criminal activity historically, but there's also creative activity historically, and maybe sometimes those two overlap. And so you see structures in the middle of the canal that were intended for bioremediation and artistic installation purposes. So there's often a connection between design and environmental remediation as well. I think a lot of landscape architects, particularly young landscape architects that are coming out of master's programs that are very high theory, flock to a place like the Gowanus Canal because it is a place to try new ideas out. And the stakes are kind of low in some ways, right? Things are already pretty crummy environmentally, and you're not going to make too much of a mess if it turns out that the bioremediating floating island doesn't do what it intended to do, right? It's just one more piece of art then floating out there. So it's just a big experimental playground in some ways for a lot of organizations that are trying to figure out then how to take it to the next step.
And is this, do you think, linked at all to the physical nature of the neighborhood, like the fact that it's a waterway in the middle of it or that it's polluted? Talking about the shape of it that makes it unique. It's a waterway, it's toxically polluted, the surrounding area is toxically polluted. Do you think there's a connection there?
Yes.
Good. That's what I think. But you don't have to agree with me, but I...
Well, I mean, I'm thinking about my home city in Newark, New Jersey, right, where we lost an opportunity to create along a canal. We ended up filling the Morris and Essex Canal, or covering it up, turning it into a sewer, and building a highway on top of it. And I wonder if my old neighborhood, the Ironbound District in Newark, if we had retained that canal, what might have been different? It certainly would probably still be polluted along like the Gowanus is. But it just creates another liminal space, another interesting space. It cuts through, and it is a scar in some ways, but it also just changes what would otherwise be contiguous street grid from the waterfront all the way up to the park. So it creates diversity in the landscape and in the urban fabric, and that's whenever you've got diversity, there's something different that can happen than would have otherwise happened there.
Great. Thank you. That touches upon what I was sort of trying to get at. And note, a lot of people for many years have been trying to cover up the canal as a solution. Many, many years. Anyway, David, do you have anything to bring to that?
I'm not sure. I guess, there's always about the potential of a place. And I think people go to Gowanus because there's a lot of potential there in terms of the building stock, the large spaces, the sky. One of the things I've always liked about Carroll Gardens, and that's starting to change a little bit with the Lightstone project, and it will change with other projects, is you have these sort of view corridors from where I live to Prospect Park, which is 1.5 miles. And in New York City, that's a long ways to see without, where you can see trees without being interrupted. And I am concerned about what will happen to that. But, the canal is this sort of object of fascination. It certainly was for me. It's like, wow, this really stinks. Like, how can this be in New York? And yet it is. And I think what you've seen around New York City in the last couple of decades is a movement. I know when Jared and I met back in the 90s, we were involved with the competition on the Hudson River Park esplanade there on the Hudson River. And people are trying to reconnect to the waterways, and so here's the canal sort of pushing into a neighborhood where all this industry came in. I mean, this is how the neighborhood was built. This is where all the materials came in on barges, and I think it sort of connects people to a larger ecosystem that is around the city that Robert Moses did a pretty good job of shutting us off from. So I guess that's sort of how I see it. I'm not sure that's the answer.
No, we're moving right along. I'm directing this water in the way that I feel good about. No, this is great. Jared, would you? Absolutely.
Yeah, I'll try to tie two issues together, which is
Please.
About opportunity and preservation. I think your intent with the slide is to expose that interesting things happened here that perhaps we can't recognize today in some way. And when we start to think about preservation or what should be preserved, it's a unique neighborhood. I perceive Gowanus to be this sort of land of opportunity in some ways, right? Artists go there and they're recreating because there's a fairly open canvas, because there's not a consistent type or typology. There's consistency in the inconsistency. And I think the same about the preservation. It's not Brooklyn Heights and Gowanus, right? There's a lot of different typologies. While I think in general it's an industrial neighborhood and there are certain characteristics or qualities that we like about the mass of the materials or how they feel or the quality of the space, I think that in fact there's a huge amount of diversity in the way that the Dumbo Historic District exists which is it's built over a very long span of time, right? There are buildings that have contributing qualities that are built in the 50s, and there are buildings that have contributing qualities that were built, at the beginning of the century, which are entirely different. And so, for me, the neighborhood and some of the things that you're talking about are connected to both of those issues, which are about how do we experience our city, how do people find and happen upon opportunity when it happens, and then when that happens, what is the special thing that they themselves bring, and is that worthy of preservation at that moment in time, either by character or through physical building, right? And so it's one of what is really the challenges of Gowanus, because as we consider change, right, a new zoning or otherwise, the Lightstone project brings to light the fact that there will be a new typology there, right, which will be much higher density, a lot different, and I think certainly in the discussions we've had with city planning anyway, where we've discussed opportunities, I think one of the things that needs to be considered is, the typology of the existing building in the new zoning and how that relates to being on the waterfront. In fact, it's, oftentimes counter to what we imagine. In other words, just even at its most fundamental level, Lightstone, for example, is perpendicular to the canal, where a lot of the buildings are actually parallel to the length of the canal as an existing condition, or they interface with it in a very different way.
I had never
There are a
noticed
lot
that.
of
Okay.
long buildings that exist, long, low buildings, right? And how do we preserve qualities of space such that the memory of what was can be, preserved in a way, right? What is the quality or character of a place and neighborhood?
Is that part of the conversation with these new buildings at all? This phenomenon you're talking about of speaking in that language.
I think it's a little premature in a lot of ways. I think people are still trying to understand use as a fundamental overlay to the neighborhood, which is, can uses coexist in the way that an MX district is intended? Because usually MX is just shorthand for it will be R. But the question is,
I'll address that in a second.
Over time, can you actually preserve through zoning an MX quality and have those two things coexist? And I think there are very different aspects of the canal up and down its length. Neighborhoods change radically, right? Whether you're on east side or west side or whatever, top of the canal, bottom of the canal, every quadrant or, every 2 blocks is different than the next.
I see Philip nodding over there. Would you guys agree wholeheartedly, and don't worry, you're going to
it's
go.
okay.
You can skip, I can skip you. Would you agree wholeheartedly that the Gowanus is actually many tiny little neighborhoods smushed together, and from block to block, from area to area, really changes in a way? Because I could say that not only have I noticed that and noticed it changing over time, the farther back you look in history, this remains the same. There is an area near the Gowanus, which is now on 5th Avenue in Smith, that used to be called Cabbage Town. And that was just one part of a slum called Kelsey's Alley, I believe. And there was a guy who called himself the mayor of Cabbage Town. That was just one tiny little neighborhood that had his own mayor. And this was back in the 1880s, but not to interrupt, but
I don't have any more particular thoughts on it other than to try to address how the opportunity, I think, happens and how we should consider it as we go forward.
sure.
Well, I think it's worth pointing out, just as a point of information for everybody here, that the area is being rezoned right
Right.
now. And so these kind of conversations are happening.
This is super important, and I'm glad you brought it up. And before I make you answer something, I do want to say that the MX thing you said is important, and we should explain it a little bit. So, and please, someone jump in and let me know if I'm getting it wrong. But there are various kinds of zoning in New York City, and that zoning determines indeed what you can build, how high you can build it, etc. And zoning is extremely important because zoning law is what made, for example, that massive building on 57th Street go up. That's 110 stories high or however tall it is. The one where the crane fell off and almost killed lots of people. That one. That exists because the zoning laws allowed for that kind of building with the right kind of air right purchases. To bring it to more local situation, what Jared is talking about is how there is a residential zoning, an R zoning, which right now I think can only go up to 6 stories in some parts of Brooklyn and up to 12 or 18 in others, depending on where you are. And then you have a kind of zoning which is industrially zoned, where you can build housing. Commercial, I'm not quite sure about as much, but then what you have is this very popular RX, it's called, which is supposed to mean mixed use. And the idea behind mixed use property is that you have both residential and you also have commercial or industrial stuff in the same zoning. But as Jared pointed out, more often than not, it just turns into residential. And there's very little, if anything, there's no requirements about how much commercial space you're supposed to have, how it gets used, blah, 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 blah. It's pretty hard to, let's say, convince a lot of real estate developers to do anything that isn't going to get them the most money. In real estate, residential's always the most money. The second downgrade from that is a hotel, because you're effectively getting the same rate of person, but without that zoning. If I'm right about that?
Retail's been changing quite a bit in Brooklyn in particular, as we see an exodus in Manhattan, where national retailers are starting to come here,
Right.
because of different land prices. But we are seeing districts now that have $300-400 foot rents.
It's insane.
In Brooklyn. So I don't know that retail is a growing sector in general in real estate, but
We could talk about retail's effect on storefronts and real estate in Brooklyn, particularly Smith Street. If anyone read an article in Brooklyn Magazine last year about how there were all these empty storefronts in Brooklyn. Before I do that, Abby, let's make it easier for you. No. I want to specifically say, we've talked about these spaces, the artists that are coming there. I know quite a few artists that love to use Gowanus as a subject. And that's something we haven't talked about in its actual existence. Some person might look at this, untrained eye, look at this place and be like, this is hideous. But I think that anyone who loves New York a little bit or loves urban space gets there and is like, oh my God, this is amazing, which is how I reacted at the age of 22 to, oh my God, what is it? Where am I? What is happening? That's how I felt. So maybe what you can help me with, and I think it does tie into all this, is there something about the actual weirdo aesthetic of Gowanus that attracts a certain kind of artist or a certain kind of person? I think the answer is yes. What do you think? Am I wrong?
Well, absolutely. So that comes from being a neighborhood that was undesirable, that nobody else wants to live in. The canal was polluted. It was polluted with toxins. It was polluted with sewage from Park Slope. It smelled different every day. It was a different color every day. Things died in it and floated in it, and still do. So I think creating that that undesirability, the repulsion of Gowanus is actually an appeal for a certain type of person like you, Joe.
Right. No, they chose me for a reason, you guys. I mean, the word that please go ahead.
I think it appeals to me. I see Michigan audience who's done amazing photographs juxtaposing nature, trying to survive in this incredibly toxic environment, and many other artists who do use it as subject matter. I think the thing that happens, I'm like, okay, I have a couple. I'm going to respond to a couple of them.
I want this to be a discussion. I'm not really.
But you can jump in.
Yeah.
Jared mentioned inevitable change, and I feel like I struggle with that a little bit. I do think change is inevitable, and New York City is a constantly changing place, and that's part of the vibrancy of it. I hesitate to think that any particular change is an inevitable change. I think it's hard in Gowanus as artists, certainly, and becoming hard in New York City to keep any optimism that something's going to work out and there will still be artists here. I think at Arts Gowanus and several other organizations across the city are really fighting and struggling and wrestling with these issues to figure out what is it going to take to keep artists in the neighborhood. Yes, to your question earlier, the housing stock, the building stock definitely made it appealing to artists. The lack of other people's interest in the neighborhood made it appealing to artists. Do I think any particular building has a value as it stands that we need to preserve? I mean,
Jared, did you
maybe
see I put
that
up this
one
one?
does. But
I'm glad you said that. Let's talk about it.
I think there's a lot of changing use in buildings and changing the neighborhood. So my one other thing I feel like is I talk to a lot of people who really care about the arts and support the arts. They walk through Gowanus with me and they say, oh my God, well, it could be beautiful if we just cleaned it up, or if we built this. There's like this real natural human tendency to want it to be clean and beautiful and see all that potential there. And on one hand, I want to agree with that and create this utopian residential place that we could live. And, I want to boat on the canal too, and someday swim on the canal, as we like to say, which nobody should do.
Never.
Yep. But at the same time, I think we just have to be aware of making some of these decisions. And it's funny to be an artist and say be opposed to making decisions based on aesthetics. But I think we just need to be clear that as we say we're cleaning it up, we're reducing the amount of creativity that can happen there. As we're pushing out the manufacturing, because it seems like a blight, we're actually pushing out jobs. A lot of those jobs are the day jobs for artists who are then in their studios at night. So I think there's a lot of implications to our gut decisions that we should think through as a neighborhood and as a city.
Okay, this is all really coming together quite well, I have to say. I put up this picture in particular because I've always loved this building. It is on Nevins Street in Butler. Am I right about that?
Yes.
And I put it up also because it is right next to the Gowanus Flushing Tunnel. That is the tunnel that was constructed, finished in 1911, that was used to create, hopefully, some current movement in the Gowanus to get rid of some of the worst pollution. Whether or not that was effective is, it's a question. It's like what engineering, conceived of in 1911 is still effective. Some is very effective and some is not. But this is unique because this building is really fun and funky, and it has this really awesome facade. It is not landmarked. It's not protected. The current owner operates, or the current owner has in that building is basically a garbage truck, facility, effectively. It's also across the street from the, and this is not my best photography. That's better. The former Brooklyn headquarters of the Association for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. And that is important in Gowanus because this area of Gowanus and Bond Street was a lot of the places where people parked their horses or stabled their horses, as you say back then. There were many horse stables in that area because it was the part of the city that nobody wanted to be in. And so that is where the creature that provided all of the moving around of everything ever in New York up until the 20th century, they got all of their, let's say, a lot of them died from being overworked and were thrown into the canal. Their carcasses rotted there for weeks. The people that protected the rights of animals, and a lot of other people considered them quacks, got together and actually donated the money to build a major headquarters of this, and they built it at the head of the Gowanus Canal, where all the horses were living. And then you see this little piece of concrete there that's sitting there. Do you see that left corner? Does anyone want to guess what that is? It's a horse trough. It is one of the 13 left in New York City that were placed by people donating to the ASPCA to provide water for these horses who were literally dying of thirst as they provided us with all of the grocery delivery that we need. This building is also not landmarked. Inside of it is a business that sells rare guitars run by a guy named Martin Bisi. All of this is happening at a place where millions upon millions of gallons of raw sewage flows out of the sewer system into the open water every year. All of this is happening in this one neighborhood. And we're going to get back to the point of everything, but this building that we're looking at right here, Jared's company wants to develop it. The city would like to take it by eminent domain to use it for the Gowanus cleanup, and everyone has something to say about it, especially me. But I'm not going to tell you what I think. I'm just going to let you know that every story in New York is a real estate story. I think it's important to point out the ASPCA building here because it is a building that comes from it's modern. It's from the 20th century, early 20th, but it is red brick and low-ish, which is very characteristic of Gowanus. It has a completely different use than when it started, and inside of it is a business that is very creative and unique that exists nowhere else in New York City. There is no other rare guitar boutique like Martin Bisi's. People go there to buy $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 guitars. Just saying. Across the street from it is the new Flushing Tunnel building, constructed and finished, I want to say, in 2015. And that is meant to increase the oxygen level in the Gowanus Canal so that life can be supported there. Look at the funky car. I bring all this together in a moment. What? Sorry, someone texted me from across the way. Interesting. Okay, so sorry guys. Using your phone is very distracting at a talk because you get all these messages from your mom. Anyway, so there's something about like the Gowanus Canal, let's say artery, this sort of like place in which energy moves in and out of, be it emotional or let's say creative energy. Real estate energy. The fact is that a lot of things happen in Gowanus all the time. And we spent so much time talking about building stock and a little bit of this and that. I want to bring it back to the person who conceived of a lot of these ideas that we are sort of talking around. And so Jane Jacobs was an urban visionary who wrote a lot about the development of cities. And she had a lot to say about old buildings. And so I'm going to read you just a little excerpt from her book, Death and Life in Great American Cities. And it says, cities need old buildings so badly, it is probably impossible for vigorous streets and districts to grow without them. By old buildings, I mean not museum piece old buildings, not old buildings in an excellent and expensive state of rehabilitation, although these make fine ingredients, but also a good lot of plain, ordinary, low-value old buildings, including some rundown old buildings. And then she goes on for a very long time to explain why this is. But that simple adage is something that we've been talking about since we sat down. That space, which we are talking about trying to preserve, trying to figure out what it's used for. In the early 60s, Jane Jacobs said cities cannot grow without them. And here we are trying to figure out how to move forward and how to grow in our city. And we have these old buildings in Gowanus, and everyone wants a piece of it. Who is the right person to make the decision about what to do? We are all sitting here at this table, and we all have probably our own opinion about that. And some of us have tried, in the case of David or Jared, very hard to influence, try to make sense of the physical nature of this neighborhood and what to do next with it. Jane Jacobs is controversial because of how much she gets quoted. But is it true that we cannot grow without these old, crappy, rundown buildings? Are we going to fail if we replace all of them with condos? Or are we being not forward-thinking about the new philosophy of urban life? What do we think we should do in the case of Gowanus? Abby?
Oh, gosh.
I know, right?
All right. Do we need old buildings? Do we need old buildings? I mean, I think it depends on what we want our future to look like. I don't imagine that it is practical that in our Gowanus neighborhood right now, these old buildings will be held onto as old buildings. I don't know Jane Jacobs, and I don't know urban design. I mean, I know of her, sorry. I don't know all of her theories in and out. I feel like this is our opportunity in Gowanus. I'm hoping it's not too late to be really intentional about what type of community we want to have. I certainly think of it more on a human scale, a people level, than the building stock necessarily, although I do think we create communities in our physical environment. And some of the things that have been pointed out, the height restriction being 75 feet in Gowanus leaves for a lot of open sky and a lot of sunlight, which creates a certain personality to that neighborhood and certainly makes it appealing for artists to do their work there. So I do think those elements are important.
Like if we were to lose...
Poetically, to say if there was a way to protect the old buildings and keep rundown buildings, yes, absolutely, we need them. That's why they're so incorporated into our art and our literature. I think when we think about a soul of a community, we don't want just all glass, all luxury residential.
So the opposite, just to keep this particular thread going, is that, well, how do we protect and preserve those buildings? Do they deserve to be protected? Should we regulate that stuff? Should that be illegal to change building X, building Y, building Z? These conversations get really heated. Do you personally, coming from your background, because especially from the artist, from the maker point of view, just to add extra to this, when conceiving of new buildings for the neighborhood, one of these, let's say, community discussions came up around, well, if we want to build new buildings and we want maker spaces and creation spaces and we need to build higher so that we have space to put those maker spaces in, does a new maker space in a new building serve the same function as a maker space in an old crappy building? What do you think about that?
Right, and I think we don't really know right now.
Okay.
I think most of the maker spaces have been in the old rundown buildings. We don't know if we're going to have to really limit the creativity and this artistic activity that's going on because there are residences nearby. We do know that in the few instances where there are residents who were grandfathered into an industrial zone and so here's what I'm saying. You have a house that's in an industrial zone, but it's grandfathered in because there was already residential there. New residential would not be allowed there. We've seen instances where that particular property turns over, a new investor pays a lot of money for it, suddenly that's their investment as an individual, that's their home, and they're fighting with the next and winning against the industrialists or the manufacturers who have been there for generations and are in an industrial zone because their trucks are coming in at 5, 6, 7 a.m., which is how that business survives and has survived for generations. So we're seeing this dilemma already. I do think when it's all driven by profit, it's absolutely going to go residential. That is the best way to make a profit. Do I think we should dictate how it could be used? No. I will flag one thing that you said, Joseph, earlier on the one building that was owned by artists. Again, like, that's great, and those artists have protected their art space as long as they can, but at the same time, when you're an individual making a decision, I don't think it's protected. I think if I owned one, which I don't, and I suddenly have to pay for my kids to go to college or my parents' health care, and that has gained 5 times in value from what I paid for it, I can't be expected to not cash out when I need those resources. So I've seen very committed artists who are committed to the neighborhood sell their property because there's so much real estate prospecting going on in Gowanus right now. So it's an opportunity to make a lot of money. So I don't think the Gowanus art scene is going to be protected through individual investments, even if it's artists owning the property.
Okay, this is complicated stuff. Thank you for expanding on that. Jared, you're a developer, so you must have a lot to say.
Yeah, this is a really complicated issue. I think to address the issue just in general, I think the difference between architecture and development or architecture and planning is that developer defines and/or the city defines use, right? So program is very powerful when it comes to preservation because you're talking about being able to preserve the quality of the experience that we understand today based on how the uses are preserved. And I think that's a really powerful tool that is one of the tools that are in the arsenal. I think, look, I'm generally, I think, the unfortunate part is that development brings change and not all development has merit. And so I wish there were ways to reward good design because history and great architecture gets made by having faith or by producing great work through design, and that happens all throughout time, and preservation in and of itself isn't always the best way to do that. I can think of some of our newer projects, certainly in Dumbo, where we've really collaborated with LPC and other things, or what we're doing in downtown Brooklyn when we think about preservation and how to address that up against meaningful change. Density is a vehicle for preservation, which is, it's perceived as profitability, but it is the way to achieve things like affordability, affordable housing, or schools, or artist space, right? There's an MIH program, there could be like an MIO program, which is about mandatory inclusionary office space, or something like that, or some other concept that, or other framework that could be created, which has to do with planning and programmatic changes, and you'd hope that good architecture could layer over the top of that, such that, again, the memory, the experiences that we have remain consistent, so that the diversity that we love about Gowanus and a lot of the other things that we like about Gowanus can be preserved. But that doesn't necessarily mean for me that it stays in the same state and it stays at the same density level.
Okay, so density is a big issue that we haven't really talked about much, but I'm glad you brought it up because obviously, again, we don't have much space here, and density is what? A real estate story. Because if you have nowhere to go because there's too many people and you have no house, then you're in a real estate bind. And so would you say that the density affects Gowanus particularly? I think it affects Gowanus because we are low-lying. We don't have that much residential space. I put up this building behind here, which I love because it's Bayside and it's low. It has graffiti. You can hear people playing music inside of it. Some kind of studio. And even, in Dumbo, there is that glass water tower that's like, it looks like a New York City water tower. That was sitting in that yard for a long time. So I was, I love this on Bond Street. But like, when I look at this, you can arguably also say like, okay, this is like a huge, nice chunk of sky. It's a nice piece of land. None of the space above it's being used. There could be 10 more, music studios in there if we just developed it properly. But then you come to the point of, well, when this design is good, then it's awesome for us. Well, how do we choose the right design? Who's in charge of that? That's where David sort of comes in next. No, but I loved the fact that you brought this up. By having a
design.
contest, you
Oh,
raised the tenor of what design was supposed to be like in that neighborhood and really challenged people. But who gets to decide what constitutes good design?
Me. Jeez.
Right?
What a question.
Hard question.
That's, yeah.
Sorry.
You know, it's all right.
No, it was a
So
great
it's
answer.
cool. You know, in New York City, it's tough. You know, you go to other communities outside the city, and you have these preservation districts, and it's a little bit different than landmarks. That you know, you're in a special area, and you have to submit your design. I mean, I think probably Martha's Vineyard does this, and and if you don't fit their guidelines, you're rejected. I don't want the Gowanus to become Martha's Vineyard. That would be awful.
It's kind of a funny idea.
Yeah, or maybe Nantucket, but you know, I mean, going back to your question about art spaces and preservation, I actually think, in a way, they're sort of. I'm going to answer this, and just let me get to the end of my answer.
Please.
I think they're exclusive because I think what artists need, what they're looking for is loading docks. They're looking for floors that can bear weight. They're looking for great light. They're looking for tall ceilings. They're looking for places to make their art. If the building has a sign on the outside that is about a company that did business in the Gowanus 80 years ago, I mean, that might be nice for nostalgic purposes. I don't know if that actually makes their art any better. I'm gonna pause there, and there might be people who object to that. That being said, I think, you know, the preservation, just for the sake of preservation, I do think is an overly nostalgic exercise. I think preservation for the sake of preserving something that's happened and it's been there and that's going on, that is, so you're not displacing something and perhaps creating, and Abby, you mentioned something when we were interviewing you for our Atlas project about, and you, Jared, just mentioned it as well, that, you know, we have the mandatory inclusionary housing program now where you get to build more housing if you make it more affordable. Well, can we do that for artist spaces? If you include artist spaces in your proposal, will that allow you to build more? Because at the end of the day, you know, and Jared could speak to this much more eloquently than I can, there's a pro forma, and it has to work financially. And you know, if you know you're going to get less money for the type of space that, you know, such as an artist space, perhaps an office space, than you would for a residential space, the developer has to have a reason to build that space. And the reason really is they're allowed to build more of something else to sort of make up for the loss of revenue. Is that sort of a...
Yeah, I mean, the challenge with all of this stuff is that it's considered bias. And so you can't, in New York City particularly, bias affordability toward artists, as an example. It's nearly impossible, and it's been litigated, and it's a real challenge, because in some cases it's warranted.
And so, you know, that's, I think, part of what we're trying to accomplish at Gowanus. How do we sort of go against what is sort of conventional wisdom and challenge that? And I would like to see Gowanus to become a special district that has its own set of rules, even if it's an experiment, because that's how things, you know, new things happen. In terms of just deciding what is good design, I don't have a great answer to that, honestly. You know, we all sort of walk down the street and look around and say, well, I like that, I don't like that. I don't know if anybody's been through Long Island City recently. I don't like what's happening there. It's actually kind of shocking because, you know, that neighborhood was not that different than Gowanus a few years ago, and it's now next to its own Superfund site, the New Town Creek. And there's just glass tower. You're not building anything there, are you? No. Okay, good. You know, it's just these glass towers, and there's just nothing contextually appropriate or even sort of inspired about the design. And I have nothing against tall buildings, but if Gowanus became that, I think that'd be a shame.
Would it be a shame, or would it be?
It's a question.
Say one thing,
All right. Yes.
just because of that. Because when bring Williamsburg into this, Williamsburg used to be its own neighborhood, and I read an article once where they said you could be any place now. Some parts of Williamsburg, you could be any place in the United States, it's not Williamsburg because of the glass tower.
Yeah.
So we're talking about character here at this point.
Yeah.
Character, preservation, these are all kind of related ideas. To your point, it would be a shame, so you say, if Gowanus was filled with glass towers, why would it be a shame? What would be shameful about it?
You know, it's just my gut level response as an architect and a designer, and I guess someone who just appreciates beautiful things. And I do agree with Abby. I don't necessarily think the sidewalks have to be swept and the graffiti has to be removed. You know, people sort of have this interest, I've noticed, in the city. I mean, Soho's gone through this, where these neighborhoods become a snapshot in time. And then that's it. It's like over. And I'm really interested in designed evolution of a neighborhood, because we cannot sit here and we would be deeply ignorant to sort of propose what would make sense in 50 years. And however, I do think there's a lot of data analytics out there now where we can start actually creating predictive models about what we could have in 50 years, depending on what certain planning decisions are made, particularly with the zoning process that's going on right now. So,
please, yeah.
This is in particular why Jane Jacobs liked old buildings. She didn't just like old buildings, she specifically liked old industrial buildings, right? Because she saw them as armatures for endless diversity and affordability. It's important to remember that she was reacting to a very different kind of urban problem in her time, right? American cities were depopulating, and city governments were enacting large-scale projects to essentially tear down old slums and old industrial areas and redevelop them sort of in the way that we've seen redevelopments like Long Island City, to use a term from ecology, monocultures, right? And Jane Jacobs essentially said, leave those places there. Why? One, because they're cheap, right? So if you've got an innovative idea and you want to test it out, or you're an artist, or she loved the metaphor or the story of being able to bake a cake on one floor in an industrial building and have a tap dancing class happening above it and not worry about the cake deflating in the oven because the floors were so strong, right? She didn't fetishize it, right? There was nothing about the oldness of the building. It was just a functional, cheap space for a lot of economic growth to happen in innovation, right? So ultimately, but she wasn't facing creeping gentrification as what she was trying to combat, right? Where we actually end up fetishizing these buildings and turning them into something other than that space for economic growth, right? So it's, you know, Jane pops up a lot, right? But, you know, ultimately it's not, we actually see something that she probably would have poo-pooed a lot of what's happening in the Gowanus, particularly with the conversion of former industrial spaces into residential spaces, not just in Gowanus, but across New York City. That is precisely not what she wanted. She wanted to maintain those spaces as interesting pockets where different things can happen, and it was low risk.
I'm glad you pointed out all that stuff, because there was, in that passage, it does talk about how you're saving money in that if you have something that's already been built and you're trying out something new, you don't have to not only worry about how much you spent building this, you know, space to do it in, but that if it fails, you're not on your ass, you know, for millions of dollars, you know, based on an investment. You had to invest very little time and money into one of these things. And I'm, again, glad you're here, because I should know more Jane Jacobs than I do. But I guess, you know, here we are, looking at, as it is, this is also a neighborhood that has always, since 1870, been extremely polluted, smelly, and all that. And we've got all these different reactions to trying to deal with it, what to do with it, what is the most creative way to do, what laboratory is working here, what is this real estate for? We're going to open up the floor for questions in a minute, but I wanted to sort of really quickly talk about this last question that I had, which I think we can open the floor with. And then I want to bring up a book that I love, which has to do with actually Brooklyn converting from farmland to urban space. There's this great, rather dry, but great academic book called Of Cabbages in Kings County. And that book is all about the lower part of Brooklyn, so everything south of Prospect Park, during the 19th century was changing from old Dutch farmlands into market gardens, which are the small gardens you get produce that you would sell and eat locally. But once Brooklyn, the city, began to expand, these Dutch farmers in the 19th century started selling their land to be converted into urban space, because the thinking is that as the city grew and urban space was, urban zoned land was all the rage, that your land was worth more as a city lot than it was as a farm. And what happened was, as is wont to happen, once one investor got wind of this being the case, another one did, and all of a sudden there was this massive speculation that was driving up the prices of Brooklyn real estate before it had even been turned into an urban space. These were literally vegetable gardens that were going for the equivalent of millions of dollars. What the book determines ultimately is that arguably, the market gardens had just as much economic value as the city lots, functioning as market gardens because of the food they provided and the way that it was more sustainable and cheaper and blah, blah, blah. But it was the rampant real estate sort of speculation that drove up the value on paper of these particular gardens. And then they were left behind or turned into city lots, and all of a sudden food became much more expensive, quality of life completely changed. So another character in all of this is economic force in itself. Density dictates that we have all these ideas about real estate, especially in Brooklyn, that are not the same for anywhere else in the world. And so I'm going to open up the floor now to conversation and discussion, but what we do with these spaces, what is the right answer, what's the best design? These are some of the smartest people I know that know a lot about this stuff. And all of us are like, I don't know, what do we do? Because we don't really know. We are doing something new that we've never done before. We have never been in a digital age. We've never been in a post-industrial age. And we've certainly never known what to do with a city in this particular case. So why don't we start questioning? Yeah, do you want to just pick out? I saw someone right here in the front. Well, right behind you, sir, is Buddy Scotto, who raised his hand very quickly. So we're going to give him the first question. Hi, Buddy.
The closest thing that I've ever heard about or seen and then made a point of getting out there and checking it out myself is the San Antonio River Walk. And
right.
Is this a possibility for the Gowanus Canal? The San Antonio River Walk in San Antonio, Texas is the biggest single tourist attraction in the entire state of Texas. And I think we have the possibility of having it right here in our neighborhood.
So San Antonio River Walk, guys, is something that Mr. Scotto has been talking about for many, many years. And if you read my book, you can see it in chapter 8, I believe. It is a really interesting urban industrial waterway. Does anyone else know anything about the San Antonio River Walk and what we could possibly glean from that? The difference mainly with San Antonio and Gowanus is that San Antonio was not toxically polluted. It was a sewage site, and they've gotten rid of the sewage problem. So we're still 2 steps behind them before we can ever get to San Antonio. But you bring it up, I assume, because it's a good model of something that can be done in a city, an urban space, right, to fix a dirty waterway.
The matter is that the community in and around the Gowanus Canal is responsible for reaching out and ending up getting $458 million to build the Red Hook sewer treatment plant. That was quite an accomplishment.
It was indeed an accomplishment.
Right.
What's your question, though?
We then found out that we had a flushing tunnel that wasn't working. And we kind of shook our heads and said if we had only known, maybe we could have got that a little extra money for that. And suddenly Congressman Fred Richmond at the time had a problem. And in order to solve his political problem, he gave us enough money to get the flushing tunnel working.
Can I stop you? Do you have a question?
Yeah.
What's the question?
The question is that we've already put in a tremendous amount of money and energy into getting this canal right to a point where we could now do many different things with it. And the idea is to understand that a lot of work has already been done. Hundreds of millions of dollars that we got done to build a Red Hook sewer treatment plant. Nobody talks about the fact that that's working at cleaning up the canal.
That's in chapter 9, buddy. You should read the book.
I've read your book. I'm reading.
Next, we're gonna have to move on, but thank you. Buddy Scotto has been a member of this community for 80 years, and at least. And I'm not to spook your age or anything, but it's important that we recognize that he's right. If Buddy had not been involved years ago, there would be no Red Hook sewage treatment plant. Fun fact: Red Hook sewage treatment plant. It's in the Navy Yard. Questions in the front here. How about this gentleman and then the one next to him?
Could or should the Gowanus Canal simply be covered over or maybe even just filled in?
Well, this has been a question that people have been asking since, I would say, they dug it in the 1860s. Normally, I would let everyone jump in and answer these questions, but I'm going to tell you the answer right now. How much do you think it would cost to get all the water out of the canal and then fill it up with cement? Exactly. Billions upon billions of dollars, not to mention moving millions upon millions of cubic gallons of toxic water. It would be very difficult to do that and a lot more expensive and more complicated than it sounds, which is why it hasn't happened yet. Does that answer your question? Okay. All right. Next question.
I actually have a question for the panel.
Please.
So how has sea level rise and the impacts of the hurricane impacted your thinking on what to do with the canal or with the area around the canal, and specifically insurance, rates of insurance?
I'm happy to tackle it, but I was in court for the last 14 days over Hurricane Sandy loss for a house on Fire Island. So flooding and Hurricane Sandy, which exposed the kind of challenges that we face relative to just water level rising globally, is incredibly important. I think my hope, and it's more of a hope rather than what I foresee, is that because we're starting design after that happened, that we can address through creative change exactly how to address issues of infrastructure, how to address through landscape buffers and other things like that, and ultimately how do we address the ground floor of these buildings. I kept referring to program. I think this is one of the best ways to address contextual kind of relevancy in the neighborhood as we think about what our relationship is to the canal today and what the density brings. In other words, that those two systems could overlap in a meaningful way relative to how we program the ground floor and ultimately what its feeling is like up against the long term. So we have the benefit of having seen the challenges, and the neighborhood feels the challenges of sea level rise on a monthly basis, especially in these sorts of months. And so I think it'll be addressed in a much more meaningful way than we have in other parts of the city because we have the benefit of being late.
So Mike, you live in flood zone A, is that right? Yeah. Mike's in our group, so I mean, and it's a valid question, and there's really, I think, just my mind is in two places on it. There is the larger issue of retreat. Retreat. After Hurricane Sandy, I think Governor Cuomo tried to do something along those lines. He tried to buy out people. I think it was in Breezy Point, I'm not sure, but a lot of people did not want to be bought out. They liked where they lived. And Staten Island as well, that's right. And that's just a societal issue that we have to think about as a community. Is that fair to sort of, to require people to move out of at-risk areas? The second part is really how do we design infrastructure, to Jared's point, that protects properties such as Mike's and others, and he's right across the street from Lightstone. So, and I believe they had to elevate their first floor. They had to redo their design after Hurricane Sandy. And I think, frankly, with the way our country works, that's probably the more likely solutions that we're going to have to pursue. Engineered solutions that prevent storm surge from damaging our real estate.
Does the environmentalist have anything to say?
It's changing the palette of plants that we plant in the neighborhood. It changes the way that we site different plantings. So hand in hand, it's all about design. Yeah.
One thing I wanted to add in that I keep hearing over and over again is that in other countries, they kind of plan around something called the 1,000-year floodplain, which is what they project, the level of sea will be in 1,000 years. But here in America, or in New York anyway, we only do it up to the 100-year floodplain. So we only think about 100 years ahead, which is, can you talk about that some more? Because I'm not a...
Well, so that's true, although in discussions with DEP on the retention tank designs, they are actually designed to a 500-year.
Oh, okay.
Zone X, flood zone X, the boundary of X is the 500-year flood line, if I'm not mistaken.
Interesting. Okay, so this is important because there are all these different approaches to developing, building when we know the sea level is rising, and that is quite interesting. Why did they choose 500? Do you know why that is?
I don't. There must be some statistical reason, but I'm not sure.
Must there be, or are we questioning every single thing the city government does?
So I think we have time for one more question.
One more question. I did see, how about, this guy had his hand back way over there. Yeah. What's that? Oh, no way. Oh, no, it was. I was afraid of that.
Thank you, everybody, for speaking tonight. I work in building efficiency and resource efficiency, and water efficiency is coming up a lot more nowadays. A lot of building owners, and for a lot of people, it's just like water charges and things like that. But in the Gowanus, it's also about how much water it gets back into the sewers. And when I look at something like 365 Bond, I see a lot more density, a lot more showers, a lot more sinks and toilets and whatnot. And as developers, specifically Jared and David, but open to everybody, coming up in the area, are you trying to apply water efficiency and other types of efficiency? Are there ways that you're trying to mitigate the amount of additional strain that all the population density is going to have in the future?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. I mean, we worked on the site at the top of the canal for a while, which ended up, as Joseph said, being acquired, or is going to be acquired by eminent domain for purposes of building, storm sewer overflow tank, right? And part of our proposal for that was in order to solve the problem, was to donate back half an acre, almost an acre of land back to the city to make green space and park space, indicating that infrastructure could have bigger purpose, which is to also create park space and green space as part of that program. When that didn't work out, we did an art-based project in the neighborhood, which is called the 2,000 Gallon Project, where we took in a number of dumpsters that we painted blue throughout the neighborhood, which were 2,000 gallons, that we planted trees in, and created a walking tour to visually articulate some of the challenges of storm sewer overflow that we see. Ultimately, the trees ended up being planted in the neighborhood. Part of our corporate ethos is to expose some of the challenges that we face on a daily basis that go along with change, or visualizing change, and using our development marketing budget, not to advertise, but to produce art projects, or to work with communities in order to find, relevancy and to address issues of change. And so through our work, that's one of the ways that we do that. We also do some of the greenest buildings in the city, or townhouses in Dumbo, or passive house buildings. And, we're pursuing options where energy resources, or just water management resources, or resources in general, are being tested to a certain capacity. I think it's not a mystery that cities, and certainly buildings, are the largest contributor to climate change through their utilization of energy, or creation of greenhouse gases, et cetera. And so it's part of our agenda. We don't talk about it in a marketing way, but we feel it's a social obligation of ours to address. It is difficult, though, I will say, to get people to change, right? To get people to think about how long they shower, or to get people to think about the shower head that they hate, which, I will put in the low flow shower fixtures, but I'll tell you every one of my buyers change out. Or, however they address some of those things, so we can try to make it part of their life, but it can't be burdensome, in some ways. People have to choose to participate. And hopefully, the good work that everybody here does, and certainly as we think about it, and hopefully being on the canal, is an opportunity to remind people of the challenges that exist when they see the next tsunami floating down the Gowanus Canal.
The word tsunami is used officially by the EPA to describe what happens.
So hopefully that answered your question. But
do we have time for one more, or are we done?
I think that's it.
Okay, we're done. Thank you so much.